Today we're here in the Engine 557 Restoration Company Enginehouse, and what we're looking at is 557, which was Alaska Railroad's last operating steam locomotive. And today we're here with Jeff DeBrock. He is the Chief Mechanical Officer of the 557 Engine Restoration Company. Hi Jeff, how are you doing today?
Hi.
So tell me a little bit about the locomotive, a little bit of the history and what's going on with it.
Well, the locomotive was originally built in 1944 for service during World War II. It was one of over 2,000 engines built in that period of time. It, as well as its sisters, were diverted from war service and sent to Alaska to serve with the railway battalion that was operating the Alaska Railroad during World War II. And they stayed after the railway battalion left. They remained on the railroad, and the railroad used them up until the end of service for steam. And this one was the last one on the railroad that was actually used in some short excursion services in 1962, I think is what the year was. And eventually they scrapped it and got rid of it. And at that point in time, it was sold to Everett Iron and Metals, I think is what it was, or Everett Scrap, something like that, in Everett. And it was shipped by barge to Everett, and it sat there for a number of years. And then a fellow from eastern Washington named Monty Holm purchased it. And he had it moved to Moses Lake, to his scrapyard that he had. He had the Moses Lake Iron and Metals, and they delved in all kinds of stuff. And he ran it there and tried to preserve it as best as he knew how or could over the years. Ran it a couple of times, as I understand. He blew the whistle on it. He steamed it up and blew the whistle on it all day long when his grandson was born, drove the entire town of Moses Lake nuts. And then as Monty Holm died, then of course the kids took over the operation, and in the will he told them if they felt they could maintain the engine, they could keep it. If they didn't think they could maintain it, then they needed to sell it to somebody who would. So they put it up for sale, and it languished for sale for a number of years. Didn't really get any serious offers on it. And then the Jansen brothers, Vic and Jim Jansen, the owners of Linden Transportation, were friends of the Holm family, friend of Monty Holmes. They purchased the engine from the family, and they got into contact with Chris Odinson, who at the time was the CEO of the Alaska Railroad. It came through his railroad careers at various railroads, but he had started out on the Western Pacific and was part of the Union Pacific system before he left their service. So he was familiar to some degree with public relations and steam operations because he worked for the Union Pacific, who everybody knows has a huge steam program, their Heritage Railway program. So as friends with the Jansens, he was kind of in the inner circle, and they discussed it, and at any rate, they donated the locomotive to the Alaska Railroad, sold it for $1. The railroad had it moved up here. I actually went to Washington to assist with the move of the locomotive and getting it secured on a flat car, getting it lifted and secured. And we brought it back to Alaska. And that was 2012. And here we are today, working on finishing up. We've actually gone a long ways. If you turn around and pan over here, you'll see the tender is complete for all practical purposes. A lot of work was done to it. There was a number of rusted pieces in the tender that had to be taken out, plates welded in, repairs to the tank. The trucks were rebuilt. They have roller bearings instead of friction bearings that are inside the journal boxes.
So this tender, was this a USATC tender used with the 060s, or? It was
a USATC tender. There were two versions of this tender, a large version and a smaller version. The 557 had originally a larger version tender on it. The tender that was with it in Washington was not the tender that belonged to it. It was an old Copper River and Northwestern tender, and it was not in any kind of serviceable shape. It was done. It was used up. So when we brought the locomotive up, it came tenderless. But at the Transportation Museum, there were 3 tenders out there. So we went out and picked out the best one, and the Alaska Railroad moved it for us. This is one of them from the Transportation Museum. It was originally behind one of the 060s, one of the 300 class switch engines. It's a shorter version of the tender. It's, I don't remember the specifics, but it's like 18 inches, 2 feet shorter. But for all practical purposes, it's an identical tender, other than the dimensions of the tank and the length. Like I said, it was the better shape of the three that were out there. We still had to replace a number of baffles inside and do some repairs on the outside of the tank. But it's been sandblasted inside and out. It's been painted inside with an epoxy tank coating. It's been painted on the outside with epoxy, 3 layers of epoxy primer, and 3 layers of polyurethane black paint. As you can see, you get the dust wiped off of it. It looks like glass. It's tough stuff too. Here is the roller bearings. This is a friction bearing box, but it has a roller bearing in it.
I don't know if we can see it, folks, but there is a Timken bearing in there. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can't have friction bearings on any railroad, correct, except Heritage?
Well, no, that's not technically correct. Friction bearings can be used, but not in regular freight service. Typically, you'll find them in maintenance of way equipment. But there are restrictions that come with friction bearing trucks. At my time that I worked at the Alaska Railroad, the G-Corps required, I believe it was maximum speed of 35 miles per hour for a train that had any friction bearing piece of equipment in it. That kept them from having a hot box, from a burned up hot box.
Okay. Well, and for those that don't know, some of those friction bearings would have like a wick inside, and if you didn't have enough fluid in there, they could potentially catch fire and melt the journal, and you'd have a wonderful day playing with that hot box. So Jeff, let's look at the locomotive, and can you explain what all's been done to it?
All right, well, let's walk down to it. So let's focus on the firebox and the wrapper of the boiler. If you look at it right now, and I'm not sure if you can get a good view of it, you can see, let me grab something to point with. These here are rigid stables, and for anybody who's an aficionado or a fan, they probably understand what a rigid stable is. This is a flexible stable. If you look up, this leg of flexible stables turns into a field of flexible stables up here at the top, and there's a duplicate leg like this that runs down the back corner over here. And across the front of the front sheet, these are all flexible stables with rigids at the very bottom of the mudring. When the locomotive was originally built, it only had 28 flexible stables at the very top. And if you look at the field, where this field of flexible stables terminates up here, you can see some taller ones called K-nuts. And those are the original 28 that went over the top. That was the only application of flexible stables in the locomotive when it was built in 1944. Probably a number of reasons for that, one of them being it was a war engine. They weren't going to waste any money or time on anything that at the time they considered to be unnecessary. It wasn't supposed to last very long. It was supposed to get shot up.
A disposable locomotive, in short.
Locomotive. Few of them lived. This is one of them. The locomotives that didn't have this is called the Flannery pattern, that didn't have these, where you see those flexible stables, you would have traditionally broken rigid stables from service as the boiler expanded and contracted under heat. They would move and they would break. And that field that you see there is where the breakages would occur. So in later years, newer modern engines were equipped with flexibles throughout that area. What we did when we put a brand new firebox in this locomotive. So when we did that, we chose to upgrade it to a more modern standard as far as the flexible stay bolts went. So we added 305 flexible stay bolts to this boiler, which was a considerable expense and a lot of work. But by doing that, we circumvent the possibility of early breakage in that area with the rigid stay bolts. Bottom line is, we'll get more service out of the boiler, less work that we'll have to do to it, less downtime because we won't have so many broken stay bolts.
Now, there is a time limit on boilers once it's in service, correct?
Correct. The FRA refers to it as a 15-year or 1,472-day inspection. That's whichever comes first, and that's 1,472 operating days or 15 years from the original date of the original. Well, let me rephrase that a little bit. There's a 1-year grace period when you put the first tube in. And then after that 1-year grace period is the clock that starts at 15 years. So technically, I guess you could say you get 16 years. But the clock starts when you put the first tube in.
So I take it 557 does not have tubes in yet.
Nope, it does not. As you can see, it's a bit away from being ready for a hydro. A hydro is where you put water in the boiler and pressurize it and check for leaks. From the hydro comes, next would be the steam up of the boiler and then finishing it up and operating the locomotive. So right now, we can walk around the front, you can look inside of it. You're looking at the tube sheet at the smoke box, and as you can tell by looking at it, there are no tubes in it. And will remain without tubes in it until we have the vast majority of the rest of the locomotive completed. That means there's drivers underneath of it. That means the running gear is complete. That means the valve gear is complete. The side rods and the valving rods are all on and attached. All the plumbing that can be done is on and in place prior to putting the jacket on. Once all of that work is done and there's nothing where we could potentially have a hiccup that would delay our steam test, at that point then we'll begin putting tubes in because we have 1-year grace period. What we don't want to do is put tubes in and then find that we have something that's going to take up a great deal of time before we can actually operate the locomotive, because we don't want to waste that time of the 15 years. So we would like to have this ideally as close to operational status as we can before we put the tubes in and do the boiler test.
So today you're working on the valves, the valve shaft, and can you talk a little bit about that and the reverser?
Sure. Well, today we were working on the expansion links on the left side of the engine, the fireman side of the engine. The reverser, this has a power reverse, a Baldwin power reverse mounted on the engineer side of the engine. The power reverse operates the reverse rod, which is over here on the welding bench. This is the reverse rod. That's the fireman's side. This is the engineer's side. The power reverse hooks onto this arm, referred to as the reverse arm. This arm and the duplicate to it, which is on that side, are called the lifting arm. Those pull on the lifting link, which pulls on the radius rod, which moves the expansion block, which is inside the expansion link. We put the expansion links away, but if you look over here, this is where the reverse rod sits in this saddle. And the lifting arm comes out over here, the lifting link is here, the radius rod runs up to the valving. The expansion link sits in here. It's a big crescent-shaped piece that has a block that runs up and down inside of it. It bolts between these two saddles. One here, and there's one here. And when it's bolted in place, The expansion link rocks back and forth in the saddles, and it's driven by a link that runs back to an eccentric rod on the main driver. What we did is these trunnions, we didn't put new bushings in this side, but the bushings that were in this position and this position over here were worn out. Turned out that the bushings out of these castings on the other side of the locomotive were smaller in diameter where the trunnions run in them than these were. So we pressed the bushings out of that side because we need to make new bushings for that side because we had to cut the trunnions down because they were corroded and rusty. So we reused those bushings. The press fit was the same in these as it was in that side, but we turned the inside diameter slightly bigger to mate up with these trunnions. So we reused the bushings on this side of the locomotive. And now we're making new bushings for the other side of the locomotive. And as you can see, we got a near perfect fit. There is no play in it, but it is very smooth in operation. About 6 thousandths clearance.
Amazing. And right here, we're looking, and this is the air brake system. Before I move on to talking a little bit about the brakes, what kind of valve system is this? You say Walsharts?
Oh, the steam system. Yes, this is a Walshart system. Which there are several different valve timing mechanisms on steam locomotives. You've got Stevenson gear. Stevenson gear uses an eccentric on the inside of the frame and all the linkages on the inside of the frame, where Walsharts uses the before mentioned eccentric on the main driver, and that eccentric runs that expansion link back and forth. That's the mechanism that runs the valving on a Walshart's gear. On Stevenson gear, you have an eccentric that runs around an eccentric position on the drive axle on the locomotive. Stevenson gear is a bit of a pain in the ass because it's on the inside of the frame. It's very difficult to work on. Walshart's gear is all exposed. You can walk up and work on this.
So the Stevenson gear, that's on a lot of the older 1880s, 1890s locomotives.
Yeah, they used it. They still produced engines with it into the mid 19th century.
Okay, so now we're looking here, and this is the brake system in here. Folks, sorry, there's a little bit of a glare, but you can definitely see everything in here. So are these the bell cranks I'm looking at in here?
Those are the brake bell cranks. The air piston pushes down on this arm. It pivots on this rod right here, one here and one there. And down here at the bottom, there's an ear, and that ear hooks to the linkage, which pulls the brake linkage forward and clasps the brake shoes against the treads on the drivers.
So recently the frame has been painted, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Yep, about 3-4 weeks ago we painted it in preparation of putting the drivers underneath the locomotive.
So let's take a look at the one driver and the journal boxes that you've been working on.
Well, I'm not sure we have a journal box out. Yeah, still over here. The driver is right here. It's been repackaged and pickled to protect the journals from damage or rust or dirt or corrosion. This is one of the 4. I believe this is the second driver. Yes, this is the right side. This is R2. That is L2. This is the second driver out of the 4.
And who did the work on this?
So we sent the drivers to Tennessee Valley Railway Museum, TVRM, and Robert Franson from Steam Services of America oversaw the project at TVRM. They turned the tires so that all 8 tires were exactly the same diameter. And then they turned and ground the journals on the axle for the driving boxes, and they turned the crank pins. And they checked and corrected the quartering on a couple of them. So all of the journals and all of the crank pins have been ground and then roll burnished. These are 4 of the 8 driving boxes. This engine originally, if you look here, you can see what's referred to as a crown brass. It's pressed into the cast iron driving box. When the locomotive was originally built in 1944, it had only a crown brass. The bearing surface, which is right here, was brass. These also went to TVRM because we had R1 is this one right here. This has a brand new crown brass in it because the original one was loose in the box. They're supposed to be a press fit. That crown brass was destroyed, so we had to rebrass this box. The other 7 boxes, the crown brasses still had a good press fit. What they did down there is they machined them with these dovetails in them so that babbitt, that's what this is right here, could be poured into the brass. So these are brasses with babbitt lining. The babbitt is a slicker material. It also has the ability to embed any dirt imperfections or stuff that get into it. So the babbitt will absorb that material rather than it working on the axle and scoring the axle up. These will run cooler and longer, they'll have more longevity with babbitt on. They're well fed.
So it'd be safe to assume that these received a lot of damage when 557 was used through floodwaters and poor maintenance afterwards.
That was, yeah. The locomotive was used in floodwaters in Nenana to move trains through Nenana with water up to and above these journal boxes. The neat thing about a steam locomotive is it could run through water up to the point where it got into the firebox and put the fire out. The only problem when you ran in water like that is it would wash all of the lubricants out of the locomotive. So when you were done moving around in high water, you needed to get out and do some preventative maintenance. One of them being, these are the cellar boxes. These would normally have oil in them and packing in them. You needed to drain the water out of the cellar boxes, put fresh oil in them. That didn't necessarily happen when this was used, and we believe that the R1 crown brass, the reason it was loose in the box is because it overheated because it was in one of those flood services and didn't get proper lubrication after it was taken out of the water.
Wow. So then as we move over here, there's Iron Supply Depot. And here's some, these are brand new springs, correct?
Part of these are brand new. These 4 here, these 4 here were built new in England for us. We couldn't seem to find anybody in the United States who would manufacture springs with 5/16 leaves. That's what these are. They're 5/16 of an inch thick. So we ended up having to go to England to get them. One of the S160s, well, 2 of the S160s that were restored in England used this same spring manufacturer to supply springs for their rebuild. So we were in touch with them, they recommended them, so we went ahead and went that route to get these springs made. The bottom 4 are the original springs out of the locomotive, and they're serviceable. These 4 springs, when we took them apart, this is one of the 4 originals. The other 3 had multiple broken leaves in them and were unserviceable. You can see the numbers on them. We would have went through and put the springs in a press and measured the tonnage, the poundage, and the height of the spring to determine whether the springs are serviceable. And of course we checked the new ones to make sure they matched the print that we sent them, and the old ones have been checked. And by doing that, we can look at the weight and the ride height of each one of the springs and see if they're going to play well with one another, make sure the locomotive sits flat and level. And here's that we're going to be just fine.
Well, folks, as you can see here, 557 is in very good hands. And Jeff, you said that you've been involved since the beginning. And I assume that when you started taking it apart, there was a whole lot of work to do.
Yeah, we, like most of these types of restorations, you don't know what you've got until you start taking it apart. And as you take it apart, you just start to discover things that nobody knew anything about. All kinds of neat little broken trinkets and poorly done fixes and all kinds of things.
And you've restored several other steam locomotives, or I should say you've been a part of several other restorations of steam locomotives, correct?
I have. I've been involved in a number of restorations. I'm not going to say that I was responsible for or completed them, but I helped along. I was a volunteer at Mountain Rainier Scenic for nearly 15 years. I was involved in the maintenance and operation of the 5, the Porter engine that was at Mount Rainier, the 91, which is a high-circ logging locomotive, geared logging locomotive. While I was there, we did the rebuild of the Shea, number 11, and we had, road number 17, I think it was, the Minaret. It was a tank engine. I'm missing one. What is it? Oh, the Climax. I'm trying to remember what the road number was on the Climax, and I can't remember. And then Chehalis and Railway, number 15, it also came up, and we were involved in the overhaul of it, because they came up and did their overhaul out right there and used our facilities and our expertise and our manpower to help out.
Amazing. So you definitely know your way around a steam locomotive.
I've been dirty a few times.
So, real quick before we're out of time, can you tell me what is needed to get the steam locomotive back in operation? And you're hoping to see her on the main line, I'm assuming?
We are. We're cautiously optimistic. We have a tentative schedule of putting the driving axles and the boxes and the suspension under the locomotive this April. We'll see if we get there. It's looking pretty good. We've got a number of things we have to do to get there, but we're making progress. As you can see, you looked at the locomotive, there's been a lot of work done on pipe fitting and in the cab. We should walk around the back and take a picture of the cab so everybody can see what's been going on in there. We're hoping that at least 2 years we'll have it steaming. There's some optimistic people who would like to see it happen this summer. I'm not sure that we're in a position where we can make that happen, but I'm pretty hopeful that next summer we'll be able to get some steam in it. It's a lot of the work is done. I'm gonna throw it out there and say we're 70-80% complete.
So can you tell me how to get involved, volunteers or donations, how people can do that?
Well, there's a number of getting involved as far as working here. Show up. We have work days on Monday, we have work days on Wednesday, and we have work days on Thursday. We also are in here on a Saturday. That's today. It's a Saturday. We're in here working. Come in, introduce yourself, fill out the volunteer form, and get directed to do something. You don't have to be particularly skilled to help out. Every hand helps. Even if you're only sweeping the floor for a day, that's the help, because then that means somebody else who's got something more skilled that they have to do isn't doing the floor sweeping. And if you're in here long enough, you'll pick up on how to do some things and move on to doing other more important tasks, or I won't say more important, more technical tasks. You'll be taught. We'll show you how to do some things. And if you're skilled, if you're a welder or heavy equipment mechanic or have some skill level that's beneficial to it, you put to work even faster. We'll find something for you to do and evaluate your skills and turn you loose on a project. As far as donations go, best way to do that is to go to John Coombs's Alaska Railroad webpage, alaskarails.org, and we have a web page that's linked on his.
All right. Well, I do appreciate your time, Jeff, of 557 Restoration Company. Thank you very much.